Some moments in history exist only in whispers, in letters burned before they could be read, in testimonies shared behind closed doors and never entered into official records. The events that transpired at the Hartwell estate in Albemarle County, Virginia, during the spring and summer of 1851 fall squarely into this category, too unsettling to be fully documented, yet too persistent to be entirely forgotten. The first known mention came from a postal clerk, Edgar Hutchins, who recorded in a private journal, discovered only decades later, that he had delivered 3 separate letters to the county sheriff concerning highly unusual occurrences at the Hartwell property. Yet, when later researchers examined the sheriff's records from that year, the letters were nowhere to be found. They had either been removed or deliberately destroyed. Hutchins noted that the sheriff appeared visibly shaken when receiving the 3rd letter, even asking him directly whether he had read its contents. Hutchins had not. The letters were sealed, though he observed the sheriff's hands trembling slightly as the seal was broken. What survives today comes only in fragments. A court deposition sealed for 30 years and opened only after all involved parties had passed away. Notes from a doctor's personal log, donated to a university archive in 1889, and the hauntingly consistent oral accounts preserved across generations of families, both black and white, who lived in Albemarle County at that time. Together, these shards offer glimpses of a story that official records never fully captured. The Negro Nathaniel, or Hartwell's Nathaniel, as though his entire identity was defined by his relationship to the man whose death he would predict with such unsettling precision. But before we understand what Nathaniel did, we must understand where he did it and to whom. The Hartwell estate sat on a slight elevation overlooking the Rivanna River, surrounded by fields that had grown tobacco for 3 generations. The main house was built in 1798 by William Hartwell's grandfather, a veteran of the Revolutionary War who had claimed the land through a military grant. It was a substantial structure for the region. 2 stories of red brick with white columns flanking the entrance, 6 chimneys rising from a slate roof, and windows that looked out over acres of cultivated land that stretched toward the river in neat, profitable rows. By 1851, the property was managed by William Hartwell, a man of 43 years, who had inherited both the land and its 37 enslaved workers when his father died in 1847. William had not wanted to be a planter. According to letters preserved by his cousin Margaret Daniels, William had hoped to study law in Richmond, had even begun an apprenticeship with a prominent attorney when he was 22. But his father's unexpected death from a riding accident had pulled him back to Albemarle County, back to responsibilities he had not sought but could not refuse. William always seemed like a man living a life intended for someone else, Margaret wrote in 1852, reflecting on her cousin's death. He fulfilled his duties, but without passion. He managed the estate competently, but took no joy in it. He attended to business with precision, but never ambition. It was as though he was simply occupying the role of William Hartwell, plantation owner, while his true self remained somewhere else, unfulfilled and gradually fading. William Hartwell was known in the county as a practical man, neither notably cruel nor particularly kind by the standards of that time and place. He did not participate in the elaborate social life of some plantation owners. He rarely hosted gatherings, attended balls, or involved himself in county politics beyond what was necessary. He kept detailed records, attended church irregularly, and had a reputation for settling his debts promptly. His overseer, Thomas Garrett, would later testify that Mr. Hartwell was fair in his dealings, if distant in his manner. Those who knew him described a man of rigid routine. He rose every morning at 5, took breakfast alone at 6, inspected his fields from 7 until noon, returned to the house for a simple lunch, spent afternoons reviewing accounts and correspondence, and retired to his study every evening at precisely 8, where he would read for 2 hours before bed. This routine varied so little that household staff could set their own schedules by Mr. Hartwell's movements. You could mark time by Master Hartwell. Elizabeth Morris, who worked as a cook in the Hartwell house, told her daughter years later, "He was like a clock himself, always moving through the same hours in the same way. Some of us used to wonder if he ever felt anything at all, or if he was just going through the motions that were expected of him." Looking back now, knowing what happened, I think maybe he was already disappearing long before he got sick. Maybe Nathaniel saw that before any of us did. Among the enslaved people on the Hartwell property, Nathaniel held an unusual position. He was not a field worker, though he had been one in his youth. By 1851, at approximately 35 years of age, Nathaniel served primarily as a personal attendant to William Hartwell. He prepared the master's clothes each morning, ensured his boots were cleaned, accompanied him on visits to neighboring properties, stood ready during meals to refill glasses or retrieve items, and maintained the study where Mr. Hartwell spent his evenings. But most significantly, and most unusually, Nathaniel could read and write. This literacy was itself an anomaly that required explanation to anyone who learned of it. Virginia law in 1851 strictly prohibited teaching enslaved people to read or write, with substantial fines and even imprisonment for anyone convicted of violating the statute. The law had been strengthened after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, when fear of literate enslaved people organizing resistance had swept through the slaveholding states. Yet Nathaniel not only possessed these forbidden skills, he possessed them openly, using them in his daily duties. The most common explanation mentioned in several accounts was that William Hartwell's late mother, Catherine Hartwell, had taught Nathaniel when he was a child sometime in the early 1820s, before the laws became more stringent and before the Turner Rebellion had changed attitudes about enslaved literacy. Catherine Hartwell had been known for her religious convictions and had apparently believed that enslaved people should be able to read the Bible. She had taught several enslaved children on the property before her husband discovered what she was doing and forbade it. But by then Nathaniel, who would have been perhaps 8 or 9 years old, had already learned. Whether William Hartwell approved of this education or merely tolerated it as an accomplished fact that predated his own authority, no record explicitly states, but he clearly found Nathaniel's literacy useful. A man who could read and write was valuable for certain tasks that required trust and discretion. What is documented, however, and what would become central to everything that followed, was that William Hartwell had assigned Nathaniel the task of maintaining a household ledger. The assignment was straightforward enough. Nathaniel was to record certain household expenditures in a bound book, purchases made for the main house, inventory of supplies, notes on repairs needed, records of items ordered from merchants in Charlottesville. It was menial clerical work, but it required literacy, and it gave Nathaniel something that most enslaved people never possessed: paper, ink, a legitimate reason to write without arousing suspicion, and hours alone with a book that was ostensibly for household accounts, but could contain anything he chose to write in moments when he was unobserved. Several people who lived through these events mentioned the ledger in their later testimonies, though the ledger itself has never been found. According to these accounts, Nathaniel kept his recordings in a large bound book with a leather cover approximately 12 in tall and 9 in wide, its pages filled with his careful, measured handwriting. The book had been purchased by William Hartwell himself from a stationer in Charlottesville in 1848, intended specifically for household accounting. For the first 2 years, according to Thomas Garrett's testimony, Nathaniel used the ledger exactly as instructed. He recorded expenses, noted deliveries, tracked inventory. Thomas had examined the ledger multiple times during those years as part of his duties as overseer, and he confirmed that it appeared to contain nothing but legitimate household accounts. But sometime in early 1850, Nathaniel began to use the ledger for something else. Elizabeth Morris, who worked as a cook in the Hartwell house, would later tell her daughter, who told her own daughter, who finally shared the story with a historian in 1923, that she had once glimpsed inside this ledger when Nathaniel left it open on a kitchen table in the summer of 1851. What she saw was no longer household accounts. According to Elizabeth's account, passed down through 3 generations, the pages were covered with observations, not opinions or complaints, but simple, factual statements written in a peculiar style. Each one dated with meticulous precision. March 12, 1851. Master rose at 5 and 7 minutes, took 3 full breaths before coughing at breakfast, Cough lasted 4 seconds. Declined second cup of coffee. March 19th, 1851. Master's hands trembled when signing correspondence. Tremor lasted 4 seconds, affected right hand only. Master did not appear to notice. March 24th, 1851. Master paused twice while climbing stairs. Each pause approximately 8 seconds, breathing slightly labored upon reaching top. April 2nd, 1851. Master dismissed afternoon inspection, stated he felt unwell, retired to his room at 2 instead of 5, did not emerge for dinner. April 14th, 1851. Master refused dinner, complained of pressure behind eyes, retire. Ed immediately to his room, heard pacing until past midnight. April 19th, 1851. Master's complexion appeared greyer in morning light, shadows under eyes more pronounced, ate less than half of breakfast. Row after row, page after page, according to Elizabeth's testimony, a catalogue of observations written in cold, methodical detail. Each entry precise, factual, stripped of any emotional content or interpretation, just pure observation recorded with the dedication of someone conducting a scientific experiment. Elizabeth told her daughter that she had felt a chill reading those lines, even in the warm kitchen. It was like looking at a list of symptoms, she said, like the kind of thing a doctor might write down, except there was something about the way Nathaniel had recorded it all, so patient, so thorough, so deliberate, that made it feel like something else, like he wasn't just noticing these things, like he was waiting for them. When Elizabeth had looked up from the ledger, she found Nathaniel standing in the doorway watching her. He did not speak, did not reproach her for reading his private writings. He simply stood there holding her gaze until she carefully closed the book and stepped away from the table. "You understand what you saw?" Nathaniel asked her quietly. Elizabeth, frightened now, shook her head. "I am watching," Nathaniel said simply. "Someone needs to watch. Someone needs to see what is happening even if no one else notices. Especially if no one else notices." "Why?" Elizabeth whispered. "Because it matters that someone knows," Nathaniel replied. "Even if only one person knows, even if they can do nothing about it, it matters that the truth is seen and written down. T is why I watch. That is why I record." He took the ledger from the table, tucked it under his arm, and left the kitchen. Elizabeth never spoke to him about it again. Not until after everything that followed had already happened. But why Nathaniel kept such records, why he had chosen to observe William Hartwell with such obsessive attention to detail, remained one of the central mysteries. And what happened next would transform these strange notations from mere curiosity into something far more unsettling. The morning of May 3rd, 1851 began like any other morning at the Hartwell estate. The sun rose at 5:23. Workers moved toward the fields in the cool dawn air. In the main house, Elizabeth Morris prepared breakfast, while Nathaniel laid out William Hartwell's clothes for the day and ensured his study was prepared for the afternoon's work. William Hartwell came down to breakfast at precisely 6, as was his custom. He took his usual seat at the head of the dining table. Nathaniel stood by the sideboard ready to serve. Elizabeth brought in the food, eggs, ham, biscuits, coffee, everything as it had been 1,000 mornings before. It was during this ordinary breakfast that William Hartwell made his announcement. "I will travel to Richmond on May 9th, he said, speaking to no one in particular, as he often did at breakfast. "The Richmond merchants need to finalize contracts for this year's tobacco crop. I expect to be gone for 5 days, returning on the 13th or 14th. Thomas, you will oversee operations in my absence." Thomas Garrett, who was present for the morning's instructions. He often joined Mr. Hartwell for breakfast to discuss the day's work, nodded his acknowledgment. "Judgment. Yes, sir. Everything will be maintained." According to Thomas Garrett's deposition, given under oath 6 months later in October of 1851, what happened next occurred so quickly and so unexpectedly that he initially thought he had misheard. Nathaniel, who had been standing motionless by the sideboard, as he always did, spoke. "Master will not make that journey." The words hung in the air. William Hartwell looked up from his breakfast, his fork paused halfway to his mouth. Thomas Garrett turned to stare at Nathaniel. Even Elizabeth Morris, who was returning to the kitchen, stopped in the doorway. William Hartwell set down his fork carefully. His expression was not angry, Thomas testified, but surprised. Nathaniel almost never spoke unless directly addressed, and certainly never contradicted his master. "What did you say?" Mr. Hartwell asked. His tone was neutral, genuinely curious. "You will not travel to Richmond, sir," Nathaniel repeated. His voice, according to Thomas's testimony, was flat and factual, as though he were reading an entry from his ledger. "The journey will not occur." William Hartwell stared at Nathaniel for a long moment. Thomas Garrett later stated that he expected Mr. Hartwell to become angry at this presumption, to demand what right a slave had to make such a statement. But instead, William Hartwell did something that Thomas found remarkable enough to mention specifically in his testimony. He asked a follow-up question. "Why would you say such a thing?" Nathaniel met his master's gaze directly, another unusual behavior that Thomas noted. "Because it is true, sir. I have observed that you will not make this journey." "Observed?" William Hartwell's tone shifted slightly, not to anger but to something closer to confusion. "What do you mean, observed?" "I have been watching, sir. I've been recording what I see, and what I see tells me that you will not travel to Richmond in 6 days. Thomas Garrett testified that the silence that followed was deeply uncomfortable. William Hartwell continued to stare at Nathaniel, who stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his expression neutral. Finally, Mr. Hartwell spoke again. "You are being presumptuous." "No, sir. I am being factual. You cannot know whether I will make this journey or not." "I can, sir, I do." William Hartwell picked up his fork again, though Thomas noted he did not actually eat anything. "We will see about that," he said quietly. "You are dismissed." Nathaniel bowed slightly and left the dining room, taking the household ledger, which he had been carrying, tucked under his arm, as he often did with him. After Nathaniel left, Thomas Garrett testified. William Hartwell sat in silence for several minutes, not eating, not speaking, just staring at his plate. Finally, Thomas felt compelled to break the silence. "That was strange behavior, sir. Shall I speak to him about overstepping his bounds?" William Hartwell shook his head slowly. "No, leave him be." He paused, then added something that Thomas found odd enough to remember verbatim. "I want to see if he is right." Thomas did not understand what his employer meant by that statement. At the time, he assumed it was merely an expression that Mr. Hartwell wanted to prove Nathaniel wrong, to demonstrate that the journey would indeed occur despite the slave's bizarre pronouncement. But looking back, Thomas would later testify, he wondered if William Hartwell had meant something else entirely. Perhaps he wanted to see if Nathaniel was right, because some part of him already suspected that the statement was true, that something was wrong in ways he had not yet admitted to himself. 3 days later, on the morning of May 6th, William Hartwell woke with severe pain in his abdomen that made it impossible for him to leave his bed, much less travel to Richmond. Dr. Marcus Sullivan maintained a medical practice in Charlottesville, approximately 8 miles from the Hartwell estate. He served several prominent families in Albemarle County and had known William Hartwell since William was a child. Dr. Sullivan's personal medical log from 1851, now housed in the archives of the University of Virginia, contains detailed entries about William Hartwell's condition, written in the precise scientific language typical of mid-century physicians. The first entry regarding William Hartwell's illness, dated May 6, 1851, reads, "Called to Hartwell Estate at 10 this morning. Found patient in bed, conscious and coherent, but in considerable distress. Symptoms present: severe cramping in lower abdomen, inability to retain food or water, profuse sweating despite relatively cool temperature in room, pulse elevated at 96 beats per minute, pupils slightly dilated, skin color slightly ashen. Patient reports pain began suddenly upon waking approximately 5 this morning. No fever detected. Initial diagnosis, acute indigestion, possibly early cholera, though no reports of cholera in the county at present. Administered laudanum for pain. Recommended clear broth only, no solid foods. Will return tomorrow to assess progress." Dr. Sullivan did return the following day and the day after that. His log entries trace the progression of William Hartwell's condition with clinical detail. May 7th. Patient symptoms have partially subsided. Cramping less severe. Able to retain small amounts of water. pulse normal at 72, color slightly improved, cautiously optimistic. Continue restricted diet, May 8th. Patient reports feeling markedly better, no cramping, appetite returning, examined thoroughly, found no indication of serious disease. Suspect acute digestive upset perhaps from spoiled food. Now resolved. Patient expresses desire to resume normal activities. Advised gradual return to regular diet and activities over next few days. William Hartwell did not travel to Richmond. The journey was postponed, then quietly canceled. Thomas Garrett sent word to the Richmond merchants that Mr. Hartwell had been unwell and would need to reschedule the meeting for later in the summer. And Nathaniel, according to multiple testimonies, said nothing at all about his prediction having come true. He continued his usual duties, silent and attentive, as though he had never made any unusual pronouncement, when Elizabeth Morris saw him in the kitchen the day after Mr. Hartwell fell ill. She asked him directly, "How did you know Master would get sick?" Nathaniel looked at her with those calm, unreadable eyes and said simply, "I did not know he would get sick. I knew he would not make the journey. That is all I said. That is all I knew." "But it's the same thing," Elizabeth protested. "Is it?" Nathaniel replied and walked away before she could respond. Dr. Sullivan visited the Hartwell estate 3 more times during the following week. His notes, Indy, Kate growing confidence that Mr. Hartwell had recovered from whatever had ailed him. By May 14th, Dr. Sullivan wrote, "Patient much recovered, resumed normal diet without incident, color good, pulse normal, energy returning, no indication of chronic condition." Suspect entire episode was acute digestive disruption, unpleasant but not serious. Patient may resume full normal activities. William Hartwell did resume his normal routine. He returned to his morning inspections of the fields. He took meals at his regular hours. He worked in his study every evening from 8 until 10. To all outward appearances, he had completely recovered from whatever had briefly laid him low, but something had changed, though it would take several more days for anyone to fully recognize what it was. William Hartwell had begun to watch Nathaniel the way Nathaniel watched him. Thomas Garrett noticed it first. In a letter to his brother in North Carolina, written on May 20th and preserved in family papers, Thomas described the shift in his employer's behavior. "Mr. Hartwell has become oddly preoccupied with his servant, Nathaniel. He watches the man constantly, follows his movements around rooms, asks him questions about trivial matters as though testing him. Yesterday I observed Mr. Hartwell staring at Nathaniel for several minutes while the man was arranging books in the study. When I asked if something was wrong, Mr. Hartwell seemed startled, as though he had not realized he was staring. He said only he knew Thomas. He said I would not make the journey, and he was correct. How did he know? I suggested it was mere coincidence. The man made a guess that happened to be accurate." But Mr. Hartwell shook his head and said, "It was not a guess. You heard how he said it. He spoke with certainty as though he could see something I could not. I did not know how to respond to that." Elizabeth Morris observed the same phenomenon from her position in the household. She later told her daughter that Mr. Hartwell began finding excuses to be in rooms when Nathaniel was working, watching him perform simple tasks, polishing boots, dusting shelves, preparing the master's clothes for the day. "It was like Master Hartwell was trying to figure something out," Elizabeth recalled, "like he was studying Nathaniel the way you might study a puzzle, or a strange animal you'd never seen before. And Nathaniel, he just went about his work like nothing was different. But I could tell he knew he was being watched. Of course he knew. Nathaniel always knew everything that was happening around him." On the evening of May 16th, approximately 10 days after his illness had begun, William Hartwell called Nathaniel into his study. This in itself was not unusual. Nathaniel was frequently in the study attending to his duties. But what happened that evening, according to testimony from Margaret Ashby, a housemaid who overheard the conversation from the hallway, was unlike any previous interaction between master and servant on the Hartwell estate. Margaret Ashby was 23 years old in 1851. She had worked in the Hartwell house since she was 15, brought there from a neighboring property when William Hartwell's father was still alive. In 1889, when she was in her 62nd and had been free for more than 20 years, she gave a statement to Reverend James Henley, a minister who was collecting oral histories from formerly enslaved people in Virginia. Her account of what she heard that evening in May 1851 was remarkably detailed, preserved in Reverend Henley's notes, which are now part of the collection at Hampton University. According to Margaret's testimony, she was walking past the study to bring fresh linens upstairs when she heard Mr. Hartwell's voice raised slightly, not shouting, but speaking more loudly than usual with an edge of frustration. "I want to understand," Mr. Hartwell was saying. "You said I would not make the journey. 3 days later I fell ill. The timing cannot be coincidental." Margaret paused in the hallway. She knew she should not eavesdrop, but something in Mr. Hartwell's tone stopped her. He sounded not angry, but almost pleading, desperate to understand something. This is not to say that Nathaniel somehow wished his master to death or cursed him. Rather, Nathaniel's accurate observation of early symptoms, his prediction based on those observations, and his making the master aware of both the observations and the prediction, created a psychological burden so overwhelming that it contributed to or accelerated the physical decline. In essence, William Hartwell may have died partially of awareness of his own mortality made so explicit and undeniable that he could not maintain the psychological resilience most people need to combat illness and deterioration. Dr. Harrison's theory was debated in medical journals for several years. Some physicians found it compelling, consistent with emerging understanding of nervous disorders and psychological factors in physical health. Others dismissed it as speculation, arguing that William Hartwell had died of some undiagnosed organic disease that would have killed him regardless of his knowledge or psychological state. The debate was never definitively resolved. By the early 20th century, the case had faded from active medical discussion, remembered only as a curious historical footnote in regional medical literature. But in 1925, a psychologist at the University of Virginia named Dr. Helen Carrington encountered the Hartwell case while researching historical medical records and became fascinated by its psychological dimensions. Dr. Carrington wrote several articles exploring what she called the burden of being known. The Hartwell case illuminates a profound psychological truth. We are all to some degree strangers to ourselves. We live with comfortable illusions about our health, our capabilities, our futures. We ignore symptoms, rationalize declines, avoid confronting evidence of our own deterioration. This self-deception is not necessarily pathological. It may be adaptive, allowing us to function without being paralyzed by awareness of our own mortality and limitation. But what happens when someone strips away those comfortable illusions? What happens when someone sees us more clearly than we see ourselves, documents that seeing in undeniable detail, and forces us to confront the truth of our own condition? Nathaniel did this to William Hartwell. He saw Hartwell completely, more completely perhaps than Hartwell had ever been seen by anyone, including himself. And that complete seeing, that exhaustive knowing, became unbearable. Hartwell could not maintain his previous illusions once they had been so thoroughly dismantled by Nathaniel's observations. This raises profound questions. Is it possible to know someone too well? Is there such a thing as too much attention, too much observation, too thorough documentation? Can the act of being completely seen become a form of violence even when no physical harm is intended or inflicted? I believe the answer may be yes. Humans need a certain amount of privacy, not just from others but from themselves. We need to not notice every small decline, every tiny symptom, every minor failure. We need comfortable ignorance to maintain psychological equilibrium. Nathaniel stripped William Hartwell of that ignorance. He made Hartwell see himself as Nathaniel saw him, as a body gradually failing, a pattern leading inevitably toward death, and that knowledge, that complete awareness, may have been more than Hartwell could psychologically survive. Dr. Carrington's articles generated renewed interest in the case, leading her to conduct oral history interviews with elderly people who might have known individuals involved in the events. It was through this research that she encountered Ruth, the 93-year-old woman mentioned earlier, whose mother had known Nathaniel. Dr. Carrington's interview with Ruth, conducted in 1917 and preserved in her research notes, included Ruth's account of what her mother had told her about Nathaniel's motivations. Mama said she asked Nathaniel once why he watched Master Hartwell so close, why he wrote down all those things about the man's life, and Nathaniel told her, at least this is what Mama said, he told her that it was because Master Hartwell would never see himself, that people like him go their whole lives surrounded by mirrors and still don't see themselves. They look at colored people and see opity. They look at each other and see competitors or allies, but they never truly see themselves, what they really are, what they're really doing, where they're really going. So Nathaniel watched him and wrote it all down. He held up a mirror that showed Master Hartwell what he really was. Just a man like any other, getting weak like any other, heading toward death like any other. He needed someone to see that, even if he didn't want it seen. Mama asked him, "What happens when you show someone that mirror?" And Nathaniel said, "Then they can't look away. Once a man knows he's truly seen, truly known, he can't go back to not knowing. That's not curse or poison, that's just truth, and truth changes everything." Dr. Carrington noted in her research journal that she could not verify whether Ruth's memory was accurate, whether her mother had accurately remembered Nathaniel's words, or whether Nathaniel had actually said those things at all. By 1917, 66 years after the events, memory had had plenty of time to distort, embellish, or create narratives that felt true, even if they weren't precisely factual. But Dr. Carrington also wrote, "Whether these were Nathaniel's exact words or not, they capture something essential about this case. The power of observation, the burden of being observed, and the strange dynamic between the one who watches and the one who is watched. In that tension lies something profound about human nature, about power, and about knowledge. The enslaved man who could see became in some sense more powerful than the master who could not. That inversion of expected power dynamics may be the most revolutionary aspect of this entire story. Modern scholars examining the Hartwell case have been particularly interested in its racial dynamics. The fact that an enslaved black man observed, documented, and predicted the death of his white master, claiming a form of knowledge and power that the slave system was explicitly designed to prevent. Dr. James Morrison, an African-American historian at Howard University, wrote in 1967, "Nathaniel's patient documentation of William Hartwell's decline represents a remarkable claim of agency within a system designed to deny enslaved people all forms of agency. He could not free himself. He could not leave the plantation. He could not protect himself from sale or separation from family. He could not vote, own property, or determine his own life path. But he could observe. He could think, he could understand, he could accumulate knowledge, and ultimately, he could use that knowledge in ways that gave him a form of power that his master could neither comprehend nor control. This is subtle resistance, not violent rebellion, not escape, not even overt defiance, but it is resistance nonetheless." Nathaniel claimed the right to see his master completely, to know his master thoroughly, to understand his master's patterns in ways the master did not understand himself, in a system built on the premise that slaves were objects to be observed and managed by masters. Nathaniel reversed that dynamic. He made his master the object of study. He turned his master into a specimen to be documented and analyzed. That reversal, the watched becoming the watcher, is profoundly threatening to any system of domination. It suggests that the power to observe and know is not inherent to social position, but can be claimed by anyone who develops the discipline to sustain attention and the skill to recognize patterns. Moreover, Nathaniel's literacy, his ability to write down his observations, gave his knowledge permanence and authority. He created a written record of his master's life and death. In a system that denied slaves the right to literacy, specifically because written records convey power and legitimacy, Nathaniel's ledger was an act of profound resistance. Was Nathaniel conscious of the political dimension of what he was doing? We cannot know. Perhaps he thought of himself simply as someone driven to observe and document, but the effect was political whether he intended it or not. He claimed knowledge. He claimed the authority to interpret that knowledge. He claimed the right to speak truth to his master. These were all fundamentally subversive acts within the context of slavery. Other scholars have noted that the story of Nathaniel and William Hartwell circulated not just among white Virginians, but also through black communities where it took on different meanings. In oral traditions preserved in African American families, Nathaniel was sometimes portrayed as a hero, a man who used intelligence and observation as weapons against his oppressor, who saw through the pretenses of white supremacy to recognize that masters were just as mortal and vulnerable as anyone else. But Nathaniel was also portrayed with ambivalence in some of these traditions. His patient watching, his cold documentation, his willingness to tell his master about approaching death. These were sometimes seen as unsettling, even cruel, even by people who had no sympathy for slaveholders. There was something disturbing in that level of detached observation, that reduction of a human being to patterns and data, regardless of whether the person being observed was master or slave. The story made people uncomfortable, said Dr. Angela Richardson, who researched African American oral histories in Virginia in the 1990s. Even people who understood why Nathaniel might want to observe his master closely, who recognized it as a form of claiming power in a powerless situation, even they felt uneasy about how he did it. That cold, systematic watching, that ledger full of meticulous notations, that accurate prediction, delivered without emotion. It was effective, but it was also chilling. It raised questions about what we become when we watch others so thoroughly, even if we have good reasons for watching. More than a century and a half after William Hartwell's death, we are left with fragments, sworn testimonies that may have been influenced by fear, confusion, or bias. Personal letters that reveal only what the writer chose to record, medical logs that document symptoms without fully understanding their cause. Oral histories passed down through generations carry their own uncertainties. Each retelling has the potential to alter details, introduce interpretations, or emphasize elements that may never have existed in the original events. We cannot say for certain whether Nathaniel possessed some extraordinary gift of observation, or whether he was simply a highly intelligent man who paid meticulous attention, drawing conclusions that happened to prove accurate. Similarly, we cannot know whether William Hartwell's death was hastened by psychological forces. The weight of knowing his own decline had been recorded in painstaking detail, or whether he would have died at the same time regardless of Nathaniel's prediction. Nathaniel's fate after leaving Albemarle County remains equally opaque. Accounts suggesting he gained freedom are plausible but unverified. The story of Samuel Cross's encounter with him in December 1851 is compelling yet unverifiable. The possibility that Nathaniel traveled north and continued his careful observations is intriguing but entirely speculative. We cannot know whether he lived to see the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, or to exercise the rights of a free man. We do not know if he had a family, children, or descendants who might carry his legacy forward, or if he continued documenting the lives of others, or if the trauma of the Hartwell experience caused him to abandon his work altogether. The fate of the ledger, a leather-bound book in which Nathaniel recorded more than a year of detailed observations of William Hartwell, is equally mysterious. Was it destroyed, hidden, passed down, or lost in the chaos of war and emancipation? Perhaps it sits unnoticed in an attic, its significance unrecognized. Samuel Cross claimed Nathaniel carried it with him into freedom, but the claim cannot be confirmed. What is certain is this. In the spring and summer of 1851, an enslaved man named Nathaniel predicted the death of his master. Using meticulous observations spanning more than a year, he documented a clear pattern of decline. He predicted with remarkable specificity that William Hartwell would not survive the summer, and William Hartwell died on September 1, 1851, precisely when Nathaniel's analysis had suggested everything beyond that, the how and the why, the mechanism and the meaning, remains shrouded in uncertainty. Did Nathaniel's observation somehow influence the outcome, or did it merely anticipate what was already inevitable? We may never know. The ledger, if it still exists, could answer many questions, but it has never been found. Nathaniel himself disappeared into the anonymity that swallowed so many enslaved lives, leaving behind only the unsettling legacy of a prediction that came true, and the haunting questions it raises. The Hartwell estate itself eventually disappeared into history. After Jonathan Hartwell's departure, the property was subdivided and sold to multiple owners, The main house, standing for more than half a century by 1851, remained occupied for another 70 years. By the early 1920s, the house had fallen into disrepair, and the final family to live there moved out in 1918. In 1921, a developer purchased the land, demolished the house, and transformed it into a modern residential subdivision. Today, streets like Oakage Drive and Meadowview Lane occupy the land, with little indication of the disturbing history that once unfolded there. Residents are likely unaware that they walk over the very ground where William Hartwell once inspected his fields and where Nathaniel once sat recording his observations. Yet local folklore suggests that something of that past persists. Visitors report, in hushed tones, an uneasy sensation near where the old house once stood, sometimes in a backyard, now part of Miller's Ridge Court. Some describe feeling intensely observed, as though someone is watching every movement, every expression, every detail. Most dismiss this as suggestion or imagination, but a few insist on something more, a patient, unblinking presence. The presence they describe embodies the same patience Nathaniel demonstrated, the ability to watch, to wait, to gather data over time until patterns emerge, the power to see not only what is, but what is becoming. It is a quiet, terrifying force, the simple yet profound experience of being fully seen. The story of Nathaniel and William Hartwell, like much of history, raises more questions than it answers. It asks something fundamental about human nature. What does it mean to be observed so completely that your patterns, your trajectory, and your fate are laid bare? Can sustained attention become a power stronger than physical force? Is it possible to be known too well, to be seen too clearly? And could any of us bear that knowledge if it were revealed, methodically recorded, in the careful, unflinching detail Nathaniel applied to his observations? These are uncomfortable questions, but the most important ones often are. And like Nathaniel's ledger, real or imagined, destroyed or hidden, they remain open, waiting for someone to read them closely enough to grasp what they reveal about observation, power, knowledge, and the unsettling relationship between the watcher and the watched.